Well, this event happened almost 20 years ago. I still remember every single detail about this encounter quite vividly. It was so random and so distinctly bizarre that I don't think I'll ever forget just what happened. Background: I'm about 20 years old at the time, and after visiting friends in college for the weekend, I found myself traveling home alone and taking the late train from Boston out to the suburbs where my car is parked. I'm running late and very concerned that I'm going to miss the last subway out of Boston. But gratefully, the train that I needed pulled up quickly. I remember being annoyed at myself for creating stress with such an unnecessarily close call, as I was definitely on either the very last or next to last train. And while I have friends I could stay with if I missed the train, I have to work in the morning, and my phone is now completely dead. The ride is long and slow, and there's hardly a soul on the train after we leave the immediate Boston area, which isn't very odd, seeing how it's Sunday after midnight. Halfway through the 45-minute ride, I doze off and jerk awake at hearing the blaring Braintree announcement, which happens to be my stop. In my foggy state, I grab my bag and jump off the train. When the moment I realize that I'm at the wrong stop, the doors close behind me. Turns out the announcement was just the train's destination, not that particular train stop. As you can imagine, I'm feeling pretty lousy about this, watching the train plod off in the direction that I needed to be going. I'm the only person to get off the train, and the station is unfamiliar and utterly deserted. Quickly I realize that I'm in Quincy, 3 long stops away from my destination, and I'm feeling screwed. I really need there to be another train. I look around and realize I'm close to the end of a desolated and strikingly dark outdoor train platform. While the chances for there being another train so late are extremely slim, it's my only hope, and I begin to feel panicked, stupid, and vulnerable. After a minute or two of standing there dumbfounded and triple checking that my phone was actually dead, I suddenly spot a man standing alone under a light. A distance down the long and thin platform. A little ways further beyond him appears to be the only entrance/exit for the station, unless there's some stairs going down into the terminal halfway down that I can't see. While the man makes me a little nervous, he's clearly facing the tracks, which gives me hope that one last train is on the way. I decide to just quietly sit on the bench close by and choose to stay unnoticed and in the dark while I wait. The bench is partially enclosed, and when I sit down on it, I'm basically obscured from the shoulders down by deep shadows, although I can still see in every direction except the one right behind me. A quick glance around, though, confirms that I'm definitely alone down here. So on the dark bench I sit and wait and feel comfortably obscured. With me wearing dark clothes and it being so dark at my end of the station, I have the opportunity to rather blatantly watch the man at the other end of the platform. The well-lit man is tall, thin, not old, 30s, maybe early 40s, slightly shaggy hair, and dressed casually preppy. He's strange though, standing abnormally still, looking straight ahead in a way that I just can't classify any other way than weird. Something's off, but he's minding his own business and probably doesn't even know I'm here. While I feel really uneasy, I do find some slight comfort in being certain that no one is down here with me, and I can openly watch the only other person from my dark, hidden bench. After watching for a few minutes, the man begins to rock a little, placing weight on one foot and then the other. He then takes a few slow steps towards the edge of the platform, and I notice that he's using a white and red walking cane, one reserved for the visually impaired, and tapping and feeling his way as he walked forward. Suddenly, I'm relieved, as this may explain his unusual posture. Just as I'm feeling more relaxed, that feeling vanishes. He's still walking towards the platform's edge, and quickly at that. I stiffen and sit straight up, looking intently. He makes it to the bright yellow raised metal warning tread that is at the very edge of the platform, one that's only a foot wide, and directly before an 8-foot drop onto electrified train tracks. He stops there, banging his cane against the edge, toes literally at the furthest point. I stand up and take a few paces closer as he starts to sway again, but this time more dramatically. My mind begins to race. What's going on? Is this some sort of suicide situation? He's in a lot of danger. I want to take action and try quickly to figure out the best way because this poor man obviously needs some kind of help. I'm just trying to figure out how to approach him because I really don't want to startle him with him being so very close to the edge. In fact, he's the furthest you can go, and his swaying has evolved to kind of a dance. Suddenly, after what seems like ages, but was likely no more than a minute or two, he stops and begins to take slow steps backwards, until finally he returns to standing still and staring straight ahead, back under that spotlight. With my heart racing and mind spinning, I return to my dark bench, sit back down quietly, and try to process what was happening. I still want to help this man, but now I'm being overwhelmed by alarms in my brain. I keep watching, and as silent as possible. He stands calmly for a few minutes under the light, facing the tracks, and safely several paces away from the edge. I decide to get help. I mean, he just did something unnerving, dangerous, and I don't know what his intentions are. I'm still sitting on my dark bench, fighting off conflicting feelings and secretly watching him, when he suddenly turns his whole body to directly face me, straight on facing me, exactly at the angle to where I'm sitting. And he's smiling. He's far away, but he's so well lit that I can tell. He's absolutely smiling and looking right at me. I'm startled by this, and my jaw drops. My mind is now racing like crazy. He knows I'm here? He must know I'm here. But if he knows that I'm here, why is he facing me? He knows where I'm sitting? Is he actually blind? But I'm sitting in the dark, not making a sound, and he's smiling at me. I freeze, solid. What happens next is so sudden that I remain basically frozen like a statue, sitting on the dark bench the entire time, not making even the slightest sound. Suddenly, and still smiling, he turns and faces the train tracks, and again using his cane, walks right over to the very edge and begins his side-to-side swaying. Except now it's even more dance-like. He then changes position, putting one foot right on the edge, and then one foot behind him, as he starts this exaggerated lunging motion, appearing to me as if he's pantomiming the action of jumping off a platform, but catching himself before he does. He does this repeatedly, and all the while I'm watching from a distance, basically in a state of horror and confusion, when suddenly he stops all of this and turns. This time, he doesn't face directly at me, but in my general direction, my end of the tracks, smiling still from all that I can see. That's when he slowly begins to walk down the platform towards me, and he's still walking right on the edge, directly on the warning track the whole time, and I can hear the clack of the cane going side to side. He's so close to the edge that the cane is going into the darkness. He gets closer and closer, and I can do nothing but stare at him. How could he be walking so close to the edge? Why is he coming down here? Closer and closer he gets, and I can now see him better. Still the big gaping grin on his face, empty and farcical, like a game show host. In his eyes, they're slammed shut. They aren't gently closed. They're aggressively and exaggeratedly closed, very, very tight. He's now no more than 20 feet away. I'm thinking that if I can hang on just one more minute, maybe he'll walk right by me. And with him out of the way, I can run and go get help. And maybe, just maybe, his facing me smiling was just a coincidence. Maybe this whole time he has no idea I'm even here. Maybe he really is blind. But greatly to my dismay, only about 10 feet before he reaches me, he stops, turns again, and faces me. Eyes still slammed shut, gaping smile across his face. This can't be possible, and I feel as if I'm in a surreal nightmare, when suddenly it gets much, much worse. He starts making this weird, high-pitched whimpering, moaning, feminine soft laugh. He reaches for the zipper on his pants, unzips them while holding his cane. He pulls down his trousers and underwear, exposing himself to me. Then, while still facing me, he begins jumping up and down, all the while continuing to do that same soft, coy laugh. He then changes position and starts doing that jumping from foot to foot lunging motion, like he's about to jump into the path of the train, except now his movement is compromised by his pulled down pants. He continues this, smiling, eyes shut, appendage flopping around this way and that, and making that same whimpering laugh. All the while I'm sitting there in some kind of mesmerized horror state. Suddenly, I hear the train rattling loud and approaching fast. In frozen horror, I'm both groveling in thanks to God and terrified that at the end of all of this true insanity, I'm about to see someone end it all right in front of me, or even accidentally get hit by the train. But right as the train reached the platform and began to slow down, he returns to simply swaying again and takes a step back. Being the very last train of the night, every car seems to have some people on it. I knew then that I was probably safe. The train stops, and I sprint like hell down the platform a few cars distance down before jumping on. I don't know if he gets on the train too or just stands there, but I definitely don't hear anyone yelling or anything like that, so I assume that he pulled up his pants either way. And so once on the train, I sink into the seat, mind thoroughly blown. My mind explodes in every single variation of the feeling that can basically be eloquently summed up as one giant, what the fuck? Gratefully, at the end of all this, I really do feel immediately safe, and I'm not further subjected to worrying about him following me off the train, even if he got on, because there's always other people getting off at Braintree. It was all just so odd and bizarre that I felt like after all these years, I needed to share it. It's easily the closest thing to a living nightmare that I've ever experienced. It was so weird, scary, surreal, and it happened in what felt like a flash. So much so that it was almost like I coasted cleanly by being scared before settling into a kind of hypnosis and being unable to move. I'm not trying to be dramatic about it. I just don't know how else to describe it. Honestly, when I got on the train, I was just sitting there a bit tweaked, wide-eyed, and really honestly laughing in my head about the sheer shock of it all. The immense feeling of relief that I felt when I boarded the train quickly changed any feelings of horror to that of shock, disbelief, and absolute gratitude. This story takes place when I was around 16, maybe 17 years old. I lived with just my dad in a small apartment in a questionable area. It was the type of place you'd not want to be out and about once the sun goes down. Up until a certain time, like 10, 11 p.m., there would be a cop or two in the area patrolling and making sure that there were no gang-related activities going on. I had a job at a restaurant in the city, which was about a 30-minute car ride and an hour and a half on the train. The train was a couple of blocks away from my place, and since my dad was always too lazy or hungover to drive me, that was my main form of transportation. I went to work around 3 p.m. and would usually get home around 12 or maybe 1 a.m. This was my schedule 4 days a week, aside from having school. I would see a lot of familiar faces on the train because of this, although we never really made conversation with each other. One night, when I got out of work extremely late, due to some assholes wanting to sit in the restaurant well past closing. Thanks to them, I missed my usual train. The next one wasn't scheduled to arrive for an hour or so. So, having nowhere to go and no money for Lyft or Uber, I sat there waiting. No one was around me, so when this older man showed up, kind of staggering a bit, I assumed that he was just another drunken hobo in the city, trying to catch a train to sleep in. Something about his face gave me the slightest feeling of deja vu, although I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I've just seen him on the train here and there. He made his way over to me, much to my discomfort, and started up a conversation. He wasn't slurring, but the way he was looking down at me gave me goosebumps. He asked me why I was out there so late, all by myself. I had to reply as to not anger him. I mean, we were all alone, and he was close enough to me to pull out a knife or something. Anyway, I told him I was waiting for the train, and he asked which one. Now, the train was color-coded with a strip at the top to indicate whether it goes north, south, east, or west. I took the blue line, but I lied and said that I took green. He looked at the schedule above the benches and saw that the green train was coming in 15 minutes. So he said that he'd keep me company. For those extremely long 15 minutes, he asked me how long I had been working at such and such restaurant. A question that would be innocuous almost any other time, but I had never told him where I worked. This made my blood run ice cold. I just looked at him and very timidly answered, "For a year." And he laughed. He said, "Wow, it's already been a whole year, huh?" At this point, my skin was itching out of anxiety, and as soon as the green train came, I knew I had no choice but to take it. I said goodbye to him and thanked him for the chat, hoping that that would be the end of it. Nope. He suddenly told me that he took the green train too. So he followed me on and sat in the seat directly behind me. My mind was racing about whether he was going to try to do something to me, like chloroform or hurt me in some other way. But we rode the train in silence. I was trying to figure out how I was going to lose him. There weren't many other people riding the train at this hour. Our car was empty, unfortunately. As the ride went on in menacing silence, I could feel him staring a hole in the back of my head. I waited until we got to a stop where there was another person visible, and I was so relieved to see a woman sitting there. She wasn't boarding this train, so I immediately got off, and the man followed me, as expected. I took a seat on the bench next to her, close enough for her to see and hear everything that was going on, hoping with every ounce of me that she would catch on. The man noticed that I was sniffling due to allergies and being out in the cold, and he asked if I was sick. I told him no, but he insisted on giving me these weird pills he had that were supposedly cold medicine. I declined in a louder voice, saying, "Sorry, I don't accept pills from strangers." This prompted the lady to look at us, and I made eye contact with her. She knew now. Now this went on until a blue train came and the lady got up, giving me a look that told me to get on with her. So without any explanation, I did. She waved me over to sit next to her, and when the man tried to follow, she said, "No, you go sit over there," and made him sit a few rows down from us. He chose a seat where he could face us and stared at me the entire time. I felt myself shaking, about to burst into tears. The woman leaned over to me and whispered that everything was going to be fine, even acknowledging that she had a firearm on her. I felt much safer there with her. We whispered back and forth about what had happened. I told her where I lived and how I was worried that this man would try to follow me home. She told me that a friend of hers would be boarding the train soon, and when he did, she told me that his name was Ray. Ray was filled in about everything and agreed to escort me home. She promised me that I could trust him. The two of them waited with me until I got to my stop. The man, still watching me, started to smile widely, resembling the Cheshire Cat. He abruptly shouted, "This is your place, right?" To which I didn't respond and just gave the woman a hug and thanked her. Ray and I hurriedly hopped off the train. As I looked back, I saw that the woman had placed her body between the weird guy and the entrance of the train, holding her hand in her purse and urging the creep to sit back down. I finally allowed myself to cry in relief. Ray walked me home and tried to keep me calm by telling me about his job and his family. After watching me get inside the gates of my apartment, I thanked him profusely for his help. It chills me to think about how that night would have turned out differently if I hadn't met up with that woman and her friend. I feel extremely lucky even to this day. I never saw that creep again and eventually stopped thinking about him. But in the back of my head, that odd, aroused smile of his was burned into my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder just what else he knew about me. This all unfolded about 12 years ago. My ex and I were visiting England, and we ended up getting lost in a not-so-savory part of town, and it was quickly getting late. This was before Uber, and we couldn't even find a taxi cab. We decided to wait for the next train and ended up finding out from a nice homeless guy which train to take. However, we had a good 30-minute wait for the train. My ex decided that he had to use the restroom, so I stood outside the door while he used it. The station itself was nearly completely deserted, save for one single other person. At first, from afar, I couldn't decipher if this person was a man or a woman. However, upon closer inspection, it became clear that it was a woman, probably in her mid to late 40s, except she had that hard look about her. She was wearing men's combat boots, jeans that were tied with what looked like rope, and a man's flannel shirt. She was skinny, greasy hair under a knit cap, and she was a bit twitchy. My ex and I were used to seeing junkies, as we both grew up in California, and our home city had its fair share of tweakers. Anyway, she sat there occasionally mumbling to herself, but we did our best to not pay her any mind. Mostly we passed the time by playing with a deck of cards that I had in my purse. The train pulls up, and we get on. It's a pretty empty one, so we have our choice of seats. But of course, this woman sits right in front of us, even though there were rows and rows of others for her to choose from. We get comfy and settle in, as we have about 12 stops before we get off. Meanwhile, this woman turns to us and begins to cackle. She barely had any teeth, and the combination between that and our heavy Cockney accent made it pretty hard to understand. But she starts telling my ex that she would give him a proper jobbie if he'd give her some money. Now, at the time, we weren't up on British slang, and both of us were like, "You'll give him a job?" My ex is telling her that he doesn't need the work. She's getting worked up, and the conductor tells her that she better quiet or he'll have to toss her off again. To this, she responds by muttering that he can f*** right off, before beginning other incoherent mumbling. It was hard to catch, but she called me a slag and some other not-so-nice names. Thankfully, we were back into the city proper, and our stop was coming up. We signaled to the conductor that we wanted off, and when the train pulled up to the stop, we got out, but so did our friend. My ex tells me that we should go grab some dinner, as we're both starving, and we begin to head for a pub not far from our hotel, one that we had seen the night before. The whole time, this woman is behind us. She starts taunting us, and I get a little worried, as obviously, sister is off her rocker. With a squeeze of a hand, my ex and I make a run for it, and we get lost in a crowd. We think that's the end of it, and head off to eat in the pub. We come out of the pub about an hour later, head up the block back towards our hotel, when all of a sudden, we hear, "That's them." We turn over our shoulder, and our friend, along with two other rough-looking characters, are coming up the sidewalk directly towards us. Once again, we book it, this time headed for our hotel, which, after a rich pub meal, isn't exactly the easiest feat. But luckily, once we get inside, the doorman stymies our pursuers and attempts to shoo them away. The two blokes that she was with immediately take the hint, but our friend continues to stare daggers at us through the glass windows into the hotel lobby. She doesn't say a word to us, just smiles that big, semi-toothless grin once more. I couldn't hear her through the door, but I'm sure there was another cackle attached to it. We didn't run into her again for the rest of the trip, thankfully. But I'd be lying to you if I said that the thought didn't pop into my mind more than a few times.